My name is Jamie Smith. I am coming to you from the other side of Lake Michigan in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I'm professor of philosophy at Calvin University. Um, and I think one of the reasons Rachel invited me to contribute to your series on play, which I love this idea. I thought I would wear my playful flamingo shirt for the occasion. Is because I'm also editor-in-chief of a journal called Image. I don't know if some of you will be familiar with this. This is it's been around for over 30 years. Image is an arts and literary quarterly featuring fiction and poetry and the visual arts and essays on culture. And I have been editor-in-chief of Image for about 3 years. And so have a lot of opportunity to engage and think about the arts from a theological and Christian and religious standpoint, if you will, and am invested in that. And so Rachel has invited me to spend the morning with you to think a little bit about how art is part of the play that we are interested in this series, and so I'm glad to contribute to that. I'm going to ask for a little bit of your patience because I'm not a digital native, but I'm going to try. I want to spend some time reading some poetry with you, and what I'm going to try to do is pull it up visually so that you can also see it and not just be hearing it, because sometimes the visuality of poetry is part of what's important about that. So we'll see how the technology works out in that regard. I guess I'm hoping this will feel a little bit like a workshop. I so wish we would have opportunity to have conversation with one another. I'd love to hear your thoughts and share your own experiences. But we'll do this in the meantime. Maybe someday I'll get to visit you over there in Minnesota. The working title was Poetry and Play, How Art Teaches Us to Be Human. And in the spirit of your series, I would say that is, and also how poetry shows us something about God, and the intersection of those two things. At Image, we like to say that we are interested in work that's at the intersection of art, faith, and mystery. And I think the play of mystery is part of what interests us today. So what I want to do is I want to put, I guess, a couple of theological aesthetic ideas or concepts on the table, just to, as a frame for us to think about why the arts are a field of play. And then I would really honestly just like to spend some time showing some examples and sort of concretizing that with some real encounters with poetry. I'm focusing on poetry. You could really have this conversation about every genre of the arts. We could have talked about film, we could have talked about dance, we could have talked about architecture, we could talk about music. I would say that play is really at the heart of all of the arts. And I think just to sort of narrow it down and give us something manageable to talk about for 45 minutes, I'm going to focus just on poetry, which also then might be a genre that's amenable to this kind of format. I think to see the arts as playful perhaps opens them up in a new way, but as I want to show, I hope it also opens ourselves up in a new way. That is, I hope it gives us a new perspective on being human. This isn't to say, of course, that all the arts are fun or jolly, or sometimes play is deadly serious. We need to also sort of expand our conceptuality of what counts as play, our sensibility of what counts as play. We I think most naturally associate play with games, naturally, child's play, and then that sort of bleeds into sport. But I want to explore how and why play is a fundamental aspect of art, and we'll look at poetry as an example. I guess the baseline from which to start here is to say, I think it's important that we have an appreciation for the rich complexity of how God has made us human. In other words, I think one of the reasons why the arts are so crucial, I think arts are like oxygen to the human soul. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of the rich complexity of how God has made us as God's image bearers. And that, in a sense, when we as creatures made in God's image don't engage the imagination, when we don't experience the play of the arts, I genuinely believe that it diminishes our humanity. That is, that there is a part of us that withers and atrophies, and in a sense, we are not living into the fullness of what God has made us to be. I bet you've often heard this great line from one of the ancient church fathers, Irenaeus, who once said, "The glory of God is a human being fully alive." The glory of God is a human being fully alive. And I would say the arts are part of that aspect of our being fully alive. You're not entirely living into the possibilities that God has made for us as human beings if our imaginations are not activated, if those heartstrings, if you will, are not being played. In fact, sometimes maybe a metaphor to get at this is, imagine that the human person is a 12-stringed guitar, one of those where you hear Spanish guitar players who just do these amazing things. So imagine that God has made us as these 12-stringed guitars who are made to generate such rich, complex, beautiful music, but we only play 6 of them. I would say in many ways, the cultural bent of a society that is focused on consumption, that is focused on commodification, that is focused on domination, that is the world in which we live is so utterly pragmatist and flattened that in effect too many of us by default move through the world in such a way that we are only playing 6 strings. And that's why I think what we need is the infusion of the arts, the injection of artistic imagination and play to actually now bring out the full chords of beauty of the human person by playing all 12 strings. And it's that conviction that we are more human when we activate the imagination through the play that is the art. That's the conviction that's really behind what I want to share with you this morning, but it's also exactly why I care about things like image and aesthetics. So the first thing I want to do is actually, I want to introduce you to a philosopher in the Reformed and broadly Presbyterian tradition who has influenced me a lot in thinking about art, and in particular in thinking about this dynamic of play. And he's a philosopher named Calvin Seerveld. These are beat up old, these are like really lame early 80s covers of books that you're seeing right now. Calvin Seerveld was one of my teachers in Toronto in grad school, and has been a significant influence on how I think about the arts as playful, and just how I think about the arts and humanity. And I still feel like he's sort of underappreciated and represented. He's still sort of a little bit of a hidden secret, I think. And so if one of my jobs today is to be a Cal Seerveld evangelist, my work here will be done. There are ultimately, there are two ideas that I just want to put on the table from Seerveld that I think help us here. And the first one is the way he thinks about the very nature of what makes art art. And just to clarify, for me, poetry then is a genre of art. I don't, in fact, honestly, I don't think that there's any such thing as art, capital A, that exists. I think there are arts, and there are multiple genres of the arts that all share something in common, but I don't think that there's any sort of abstract thing called art. But poetry would be one of the arts that it embodies this. And what Seerveld has always convinced me of is that at the heart of art, I'm going to have to stop saying that phrase because it's getting annoying. Let's say at the root of what counts as aesthetic experience, at the basis of what counts and what we experience as artistic encounter, is what he calls allusivity, allusion, allusivity. And what he means by that, let me indulge me for a second. I want to show you one, let you hear him say what he means by this. He says, what sets off art from peeling potatoes and riding a bike or bare handicraft is not that it is fine art or that it is marked necessarily by beauty. This is important. I wish we were having a conversation because I would love to talk about why art is not synonymous with beauty, but footnote for later. So he says, what defines art is not beauty. It's not that it's fine art and that has to be in a museum. What is it that distinguishes something artistic from, say, the quotidian act of peeling potatoes? Here's his answer. Peculiar to art is a parable character, a metaphoric intensity, an elusive play in its artifactual presentation of meanings apprehended. Okay, it's actually a really rich sentence, but it's a tad deep, a tad dense. So let me read that to you one more time. Peculiar to art, he says, is a parable character. Okay, now we know we see what he's talking about. Why does Jesus talk to us in parables? Why doesn't he give us the truth, quote unquote, straight up? Well, because in fact, the parable character of something, that allusivity, that obliqueness of a story carries truth and opens up the world for us in ways that are more than we can say. That's why he says, peculiar to art is a parable character, a metaphoric intensity. Why metaphor? Again, what's going on in a metaphor is you get word pictures, right? Somebody says, my love is like a rose. And what's going on here is that has activated now this kind of universe of associations and images and symbols in your mind. And what's beautiful about the way metaphor works is that metaphors always mean more than they say, right? There is a capacity in metaphor to mean so much more than just what the line says, because actually in the playfulness of metaphor, in the dance of associating one thing with another, of invoking this picture and then letting your mind sort of traverse around in the space of that picture that's been opened up, actually what's happening is you're being invited into a kind of dance and playfulness of meaning, which also not even the author entirely controls, because the author can't even entirely anticipate what bells are going off and what signals and synapses are firing for you when you hear that metaphor. So it's a way of using language, a way of using images that is sort of more than the sum of its parts. That's what's going on in a parable. That's what's going on in metaphor. And then he says, hence, finally, peculiar to art is an elusive play, which is also allusive, that is, it evokes echoes. There's a kind of meaning that's at work here that is sort of playing off other things. That's why it's think of play now, not just in terms of games, but play in terms of bouncing off of the dance of how meaning is generated for us. I think that's a really, really suggestive way of appreciating what is going on in the arts more generally. And so now let me zoom in. What's going on in poetry? Why is poetry playful, even if it might be deadly serious? Well, because poetry is like this intensification of language. It sort of brings, let's be honest, for the most part in the normal workaday lives that we live, language is kind of a tool that we use to communicate, to transact things, to manage things, to basically make our way in the world. And language is in that sense sort of invisible. I mean, we're using it all the time, but because it is so part of the water that we're swimming in, we don't even notice it. And one of the beautiful things that I love about poetry is that it has this, it's almost like, you grind the record to a stop, because what poetry does is it then takes the language that you're using every day and it brings it up front and center. And all of a sudden you dwell in language and with language in a new and intense way, precisely because the poet, in her artifice, in what she has crafted, is sort of bringing that up to the surface in a new way to encounter. And then you leave that encounter and go back to your everyday changed. You can't leave an artistic encounter the same. Doesn't mean that you always remember it. It doesn't mean like it's highlight. All I would say is what has happened is you have now passed through a way of being in the world that you carry with you back into your quotidian, everyday work life experience, so to speak. So this way that language plays is at the very heart of how metaphor works, how parable works. Indeed, I would say this is exactly what the incarnation is, right? If you think of it, at the very heart of Christian faith is this mystery of the God-man who is Jesus Christ, eternity intersecting with time, and that God speaks. I always like, in Hebrews 1, first couple of verses of Hebrews, it's something like, forgive me, I should know my Bible better, but it's something like, at various times in sundry ways, I think, as the King James used to put it, God spoke through the prophets. But now in these last days, he has spoken, and the Greek, as I recall, is quite literally in Son. In other words, the language that God ultimately and most fundamentally speaks to humanity is Son. This Jesus, this one, this enfleshed one, this embodied one, this one who comes and shows us God in his very being. But what's interesting is there is still an allusivity about how the incarnation works. There is still a play about how the incarnation works, because the fact is, and this is a great theme in Kierkegaard. You'll have to forgive me. I assume just everybody in Minnesota loves Kierkegaard, the great Lutheran Christian philosopher. But Kierkegaard, he's constantly pointing out all the ways that, when God shows up in this Jesus who comes in the form of a servant, it also means you can completely miss it. The God-man can just be one other dude walking down the street. You know what I mean? You can't, there is a certain kind of hiddenness that nonetheless goes with the self-revelation that is the incarnation. That's where some of the play and obliqueness and allusivity of how God's own self-revelation works. You know that great Emily Dickinson line, tell the truth, but tell it slant. Well, it turns out telling it slant is exactly what God does. That's exactly how God's own self-revelation takes place, even in its ultimate culmination in the incarnation itself. God is the primary poet, you could say. God is the first poet. And I mean, I think this is another reason too why the Psalms have so long been the hymn book of the people of God, because of the power of image. Let me give you one example. This is going to be very, very familiar to you, but now I just want you to hear it afresh, given our thinking together about poetry. This is Psalm 139, one of the central sections of it that is just, to me, the very height of Scripture's poetry and God's comfort. This is beginning at verse, I'll begin at verse 7 in Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. Even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. And you hear that picture, right? You hear that metaphor, and it's generating all kinds of meaning, even in its paradox and in its contradictoriness. And you're trying to imagine, what would it mean for the night to be bright? What would it mean for darkness to be light to God? And why does that mean that I am always illumined in his care and in his attention, in his presence? There's a reason why you could live an entire life dwelling with the meaning and significance of this psalm, because of the play of metaphor that keeps generating something for us. And so that metaphoricity is at the heart of poetic play, that dance of meaning that is generated in comparisons, contradictions, the way language works. All of that is at the very heart of the way poetic play works. So, as I said, what happens in poetry is I don't know if any of you are cooks, chefs. I am not. I am a sous chef to my wife, who's the gourmet. But I know this. I know something about a reduction, okay? Right? Which is what's going on in a reduction when you're in the kitchen is you're sort of bringing something down to its most intense form. And in a way, that's what poetry does with language. In poetry, language is condensed, it's refined, it's reduced, if you will, to heighten its metaphorical power, its capacities, its ability to let meaning emerge in this play of illusions and resonances and echoes, and also the unique delights of cadence and meter and sound. And we are these sort of tactile, visceral, embodied creatures for whom those rhythms and cadences and lilts mean something. It's not a meaning that you can then translate into, some propositional distillation. One of the rules of reading poetry is that poetry cannot be paraphrased. That meaning is carried in the very form of the poem and how we experience language in it. And one of the things that is still kind of inexplicable, actually, we don't have enough time to talk about this, but one of the things that they're realizing in this pursuit of artificial intelligence is that no one is even close to creating a machine that can get the meaning of the lilt of a poem. It's like you need bodies for that to happen. And so that's part of, I would say, the delight of poetry is learning to dwell in language in such a way that you experience its power, its capacity, its movement, its delight in ways that you can't always put into words. A poem always means more than you can say. And don't ever feel like you have to justify why you like a poem, right? Resist that, because what will happen is somebody will say, well, you're going to have to explain this to me. I don't understand, convince me to like this poem. No, don't play that game. That's part of the mystery of what's going on here. And to be generous, the same poem is not going to work for everybody in the same way. Okay, I've been talking about poetry for too long. Let's see if we can experience some poetry together. Apologies if my dog is barking in the background. So what I want to do is I want to think about this. I want to give you 3 examples to start of poems that I think sort of revel in language, as almost all poems do, and yet are also doing something else to us and mean something else, even while they are sort of taking delight in the play of language. And the first one is by a contemporary, a younger Catholic poet named Leila Chati. And I want to show you, so here's where the tech limits come in. I'm going to try to share my screen. And what I'll do is I'll try to put this up as I'm reading with you. So hopefully this will work. This is a poem called, appropriately, Echo. So it's getting at something that I've just been saying is at the very heart of poetry itself. And I want to read this with you, to you. And I'll say just this as a word of contextualization to let you quickly enter into it, which is I have, and I don't even know if this is what the poet intended, but I have always read this as a poem that is entering into the space of dementia and perhaps Alzheimer's, about the loss of language. Okay, it's called Echo. And apologies if, do you know how it is where you grow up working class and you know how to read words, but you don't know how to say words? I never know when I'm going to encounter that, okay? So be patient with me. Echo. All she lost at once. Her mouth could no longer offer at breakfast apricot. Acerbic syllables on the tongue. Acquiesce was gone. Allure and ardent. Ache refused to be named, but remained a thorn in her breast. Breast, she couldn't say. Couldn't say, come closer. Couldn't say cock or covet, blessing or blue. Losing beauty didn't so much upset her. It was a word which lessened the thing itself. Desire was never enough for her. Despair too enormous for language. But she rather missed endure, missed earnest and empty, eggs and exultation. Feelings, she discovered, were awful if solely felt, unspoken. They were egregiously real. For reasons unknown to her, she wished very much, very often to say field. She just wanted to fill again her mouth with grasses and excessive sadness. Oh, how she loved gratitude. She would say it over and over until her heart believed her. It was her only prayer. She regretted never uttering ichor, when she had the chance. Intimacy was underutilized, idle, inkling, illume, though in truth some things were always ineffable, and she relieved to be relieved of the duty of trying. Just having the basics would have sufficed. She would have gladly relinquished jest and jejune and jacaranda to keep kindness and kinky and kin, lemon and lace and love. Perhaps this, what she longed for most, as unbearable as it was to be so monstrously human. Before she thought maybe she was needless, obdurate as a stone or the wind which touched everything with a pernicious detachment. Please was the first word she attempted in the meadow, trembling as the dark stayed terribly quiet. She had never heard such quiet. It was a quiet longer than death. When above her at last a storm ruptured, she repeated keenly its howl, awash with rage. Oh, she was certain if she could recover suffering, she'd refuse to say anything else for all her days. Her mouth and mouthed youthlessly salt, mouthed sate, mouthed salve. She waited in the shade for a stranger to voice what she knew to be urgently true. She resented both the voice and the waiting, and the birds their unavailing refrains, undeserving of their instruments and uncharitably vociferous at dawn. Frogs their lubricious clamor, katydids violent ubiquitous chorus. It was an error not to appreciate umbrage fully, nor vex, nor volition. She never had an occasion for virtue, but returned to her vainglory and vesper, wished for waffle and wallop and wasp. Why not, she wanted wrong. It exhausted her, her xenogetic lexis, her inexpressible grief, what she would give to whisper yellow just once to what was, petals and morning yawning brightly before her, to sigh yes, to say you, oh, to say you. But her maw hung open, futile, zero, destitute. There's something a bit gauche to even comment. I love the poem because I hope you could feel a kind of emotional arc to what's happening there, and you're invited inside someone in a way that you couldn't be granted entry in any other way, it seems to me. And yet the poem is also just this wonderful revel in language, and it takes you from A to Z, and it's sort of, it dwells in and is unapologetic about the fierce artifice of what's going on. And yet there's also a kind of invisibility about it. I think it's just a marvelous, she's one of our real greats right now. And if Leila Chati is new to you, I encourage you to go out and find more of her work. That appeared in a recent issue of Poetry magazine. Let me show you something shorter by Maggie Nelson, Maggie Smith. This is a poem that appeared in a recent issue of Image Journal, actually, in Image 103. And it's interesting, this issue was published just before the pandemic beset us. And I remember reading this to someone in March in Washington, D.C., and you felt like you were just getting the inkling of its significance. It's called Confession. And you'll see in a moment, I think, why I mentioned the pandemic. Here is an example, I would say, of a poem that, again, takes you allusively, suggestively, playfully, in that sense, inside someone else's experience. But what I also love about it is it shows you how someone's experience is opened up to God. So this is Confession by Maggie Smith. If I could figure out the tech here, it would have been fun for me to play. If you go to Image's website, imagejournal.org, what we try to do is ask all of our poets to record themselves reading their poems, but I couldn't figure out how to get audio to play for you. So this is Confession by Maggie Smith. My son's terrible fevers are softening me to God, to the idea. When he sizzles to the touch, speaks a strange new language of not consonants and not vowels, I need one golden iteration I can live with. When even syntax is burnt black, smelling of creosote. By nightlight, I mitten his hands and sock his feet with cold washcloths. I wipe down his cheeks and forehead, his chest and the back of his neck. He is nearly too big, but I lift him, hold him, guitar slung across my body, and sway. Now and then he whimpers, brain blazing. This is terror, and this must be how it happens, how need alchemizes into belief. I try to visualize being held myself in a cupped hand, in the shining idea of a hand. I try to feel myself held, holding, my arms tremble with the weight. It's such a marvelously intimate picture of an experience that will be very common to many of us, I'm sure. And yet it sort of almost gives us permission to feel how harrowing it is. And then to even, in that sense, it's a bit like the psalm. You can see how for me, the arts are one of the most potent cracks in the secular. That is, the arts are one of the places where you can hear in our secular age this enduring longing for something more, for someone who holds us. And this is just a beautiful, beautiful, powerful example of this. Let me give one more example of a poem, and I'm kind of intentionally not trying to like exegete these, because in a sense that violates my conviction that poetry shouldn't be paraphrased. That's not to say that there isn't a place for poetic criticism, right? Not just being critical, but opening it up. This morning, I would like, in the time we have for you, to sort of hear and experience more poetry, and maybe for that to be a tease and to whet your appetite a little bit more. Let me show one more example, then I'll put one other idea on the table for us, and we'll encounter a couple of other poems. Lucille Clifton was a Black poet in the mid to late 20th century. I was just recently reading a marvelous new collection from the Library of America called simply African American Poetry, 200 Years of Struggle and Song, and was sort of dwelling with Clifton's work again for a while. And it struck me, this is why poetry in its playfulness can also be prophetic. In its metaphoricity can actually sometimes be more incisive, because it kind of cuts through the flesh and marrow, as it were, and it can hit us in ways that we might not have otherwise. And to go back to Clifton after the murder of George Floyd, I think is to hear somebody who's been a prophetic, poetic voice for so long, which is true of so many of Black poets from since the Harlem Renaissance and well, in that 250 years of song. But this is a poem called Study the Masters. And what I love is the play. There's a turn here. There's a flipping of the script that takes place. Study the masters. Like my Aunt Timmy, it was her iron or one like hers that smoothed the sheets the master poet slept on. Home or hotel, what matters is he lay himself down on her handiwork and dreamed. She dreamed too. Words, some Cherokee, some Maasai, and some huge and particular as hope. If you had heard her chanting as she ironed, you would understand form and line and discipline and order and America. What I think is so powerful about this poem is the illusion of simplicity, right? If you set this poem alongside the chatty poem Echo, there is, reading Chatty's Echo is like reading a lexicon too. There's the range of language, and we love it. Isn't it incredible that we have this richness of ways of naming and describing and encountering our world? But then what you also get in Lucille Clifton is this kind of reduction of speech, where there's no fancy words you need to go look up in the dictionary here, and yet for that reason, its potency is probably all the more powerful. There is a way in which it cuts to the heart. And what's going on here in the form, notice at the heart of poetry is line break, right? So it's very hard to define poetry. And one person has actually suggested that what makes poetry is line break. And the decision of where a line ends means something. And so when you get to those last few lines, if you listen to her chanting, you would understand form and line and discipline and order. And so, in other words, if you would have listened to her chant, you would learn what the master poet has always been talking about. But then you would learn one more thing from her. You would learn America. You would hear something about America's story that the master poet was probably never talking about. It's that sort of, that turn, that line break of the and then the one word line America at the end is doing something. It has a cadence about it that means something. Okay, let me put one more idea on the table and then a couple more poems. I have to confess, I have no idea how long I've been speaking. So hopefully we're doing okay on time. One more idea from Searville, and I would say, I guess I want to acknowledge that poetry feels like a bit of a hard sell these days. I mean, it's just, it's very hard to get people to sit down with poetry. And I think I partly understand that. I think there is, especially in contemporary poetry, because it's part of a long conversation that we haven't been part of, there is a way in which contemporary poetry can feel alienating. I think there are ways to overcome that. I don't think it's trying to be alienating. I think it's just in conversation with centuries of poetry that's come before it. So I understand the difficulty. I think probably our bigger problem is just that we lack the patience for poetry. And I think that cultural trends and defaults breed that in us because we want everything sort of easy and fast. And that's true of we want news that confirms all our biases. We want a very easy Instagram feed that we can scroll through and just gives us quick little jolts of pleasure, delight, or outrage, as we might sometimes want. And we want everything sort of easily accessible to us. We want it available. We want it bite-sized. We want it fast. And we want it easy, not to ask too much of us, other than to give it our incessant attention. But we don't want to have to expend too much energy on that attention. We want to just passively receive. I think that is, to be that kind of people is to not know how to be contemplative. And if we lose the capacity for contemplation, I honestly think I believe we lose the capacity for discipleship. The capacity to be contemplative, to be introspective, seems to me at the very heart of Christian formation. So I think we need to ask ourselves, what is going on in our cultural default such that we want everything easy and accessible and quick and digestible and bite-sized and something that we can, well, ultimately, I would say, master. This is again a feature of the pragmatism of our moment, that we We want, give us news we can use, so to speak. Give us stuff we can do something with. And I think that is the enemy of play. That instrumentalist attitude, give me information that I can master so I can use it, that is the very antithesis of play. And in that sense, we are going to have to cultivate capacities to be able to resist that. And I guess I'm suggesting in some ways, if you want to find a discipline to counter, to resist those cultural defaults, I think learning to love poetry is part of it. It's embracing something useless, if you will. It's embracing something that doesn't have immediate sort of payoff. And yet that's the beauty of it. This is where I want to introduce one more idea from Seerveld, which is, and this is actually, some of you have probably encountered this idea in a classic book by Josef Pieper called Leisure as the Basis of Culture. And it's this theme of leisure being really having room in a life to play is the condition of possibility, both for making art and receiving the arts. And I would say that's obviously true of poetry. So let me see, and Seerveld has this great announcement. This is from a different book called Normative Aesthetics, which sadly has a horribly ugly cover, the irony. But he says, he zooms in on this sense of why leisure is at the very heart of an aesthetic life. And he says this: if we descendants of the Reformation faith take time to plant flowers and watch them grow, reserve a place in our busy lives to read and tell imaginative stories to our children and grandchildren, hold extended candlelight tete-a-tete conversations with guests at a meal, such exercises of one's aesthetic life capabilities tends to rub off on or seep into our other responsibilities, gives aesthetic color to the lines of what we do non-aesthetically. I love what he's saying is what we would have to do. There's a bit of a kind of feedback loop here and a sort of mutuality. On the one hand, if you are going to become somebody who enjoys the play of poetry, you are going to have to make time. You're going to have to find margin. You're going to have to learn to dwell with things. On the other hand, if you become the kind of person who starts to enjoy reading poetry, it's going to be training you to be less instrumental, to be less technocratic, to be not to delight in something that appears to be useless, if you will. And that sense of making room for leisure, especially for those of us in Reformation traditions where the work ethic, it's sort of like, what have you done? God saying to us, what have you done for me lately? To rest is the condition of artistic play. It's the condition of creation. It's also the condition for reception of the arts and poetry. I love it when he talks about planting flowers. You know, one of my favorite things in the world is my wife's a master gardener, has incredible flowers here. What she regularly does is she brings me incredible, this guy needs a little water, but almost every week I have some cut flowers on my desk. And it's like, why? Because it's beautiful, because it's delightful, because it's my office is richer for it. And that same spirit, if you will, is about why we should read poetry. So let me close with a couple more examples. And let's see, what shall I share with you? Let me give you, this will be a fun one. One of the things I would say is the play of the arts is a space in which we kind of grant permissions to muse that we don't grant in other spaces. Think of the parallel in games. In games, we carve out a field of play, if you will, where the rules of engagement are different. Now, some of those rules are more restrictive. You can't touch the ball with your hands or whatever it might be. On the other hand, in some games, you are also allowed to do things that you can't do in everyday life. I grew up in Canada. I trust in Minnesota, you're well familiar with hockey. Hockey is a game where I'm permitted to do things to other people that I could never do walking down the street here. So my friends always tell me Reformed church leagues are the worst. But there's just, I'm not endorsing unsanctified play. All I mean is it is at the very nature of play to create these spaces in which we play games because the rules are suspended and changed in ways that permit us to do something. I think that's exactly true in poetry, in all the arts. It's what we call, you've surely heard the phrase, metaphorical license or poetic license. Oh, well, we're going to grant him poetic license. Yes, that's exactly right. There's a way in which there is a kind of musing that we permit in poetry that, look, you don't want it to set the policy for an institution or become the creed of a church. And yet there can be a kind of truth in the poetic license that we appreciate anew. Okay, here's the example I want to show you of a poem that does that. This is by the poet Anne Sexton, and it is called The Earth. I use this poem regularly in my classes. And it's an example to me of a wonderfully playful use of language that is actually meditating on something about God, that if you kick into your sort of like theological mode, you're like, I don't know about that. But what I'm saying is suspend that, grant it the play of poetic license, and then actually see what beautiful truths about God are unveiled in the poem. Okay, The Earth, and this is by Anne Sexton. God loafs around heaven without a shape, but he would like to smoke his cigar or bite his fingernails and so forth. God owns heaven, but he craves the earth with its little sleepy caves, its bird resting at the kitchen window, even its murders lined up like broken chairs, even its writers digging into their souls with jackhammers, even its hucksters selling their animals for gold, even its babies sniffing for their music. The farmhouse, white as a bone, sitting in the lap of its corn, even the statue holding up its widowed life, even the ocean with its cup full of students. But most of all, he envies the bodies. He who has no body, the eyes opening and shutting like keyholes and never forgetting, recording by thousands, the skull with its brain like eels, the tablet of the world, the bones and their joints that build and break for any trick, the genitals, the ballast of the eternal, and the heart, of course, that swallows the tides and spits them out cleansed. He does not envy the soul so much. He's all soul, but he would like to house it in a body and come down and give it a bath now and then. Let the doctrine police worry about this somewhere else. I know, on the other hand, what a powerful invocation of the incarnational impulse of our God, for whom divinity is not allergic to materiality, right? And the concreteness with which she evokes this is so wonderful and powerful and playful, honestly playful. And I think that is also takes us into an imagining of God that we don't always get, maybe especially in our Reformed traditions. Okay, let me close with one last poem. This is by a poet in my own Dutch Reformed tradition named Rod Jellema. He was a longtime professor at the University of Maryland, a graduate of Calvin College here where I teach. And this poem, let me give you a little bit of context before I say it. It's going to be called "We Used to Grade God's Sunsets." And it's what you have to do is picture the stunning beauty of Michigan's West Coast on the lake over here, which is, if you haven't experienced it, is really just rivals LA. And one of the things that we do in summer after long, gray, dark winters here in Grand Rapids is everyone revels in sunsets on the lake as much as possible. And Jellema is capturing something of that practice, if you will, in this poem called "We Used to Grade God's Sunsets from the Lost Valley Beach." Why we really watched, we never said. The play of spectral light, but maybe also the coming dark, and the need to trust that the fire dying down before us into Lake Michigan's cold waves would rise again behind us. Our arch and witty critiques covered our failures to say what we saw. The madcap mockery of grading God as though he were a struggling student artist. Cut loose, strip it down, study Matisse and risk something unseen, C+, keep trying, that sort of thing. Only hid our fear of his weather howling through the galaxies. We humored a terrible truth, that nature gives us hope only in flashes, split seconds, one at a time, fired in a blaze of beauty. Picking apart those merely actual sunsets, we stumbled into knowing the artist's job, to sort out, then to seize and work an insight until it's transformed into permanence. And God, brushing in for us the business of clouds and sky, really is a hawker of cliches, a sentimental hack as a painter. He means to be. He leaves it to us to catch and revise, to find the forms of how and who in this world we really are and would be, to see how much promise there is on a hurtling planet, swung from a thread of light and saved by nothing but grace. If I have to be exiled to a desert island, I will take the Psalms and I will take that poem, and it will keep generating meaning and significance and terror and hope and hunger for the rest of my days, because it plays, it dances, its meaning can never be mastered. And that's the delight that we are invited into in the play of poetry. So I hope that might be a teaser for some of you. I'm sure many of you already appreciate poetry, and I hope you'll be encouraged to share with one another. And if not, let me encourage you, if you're looking a way to sort of start, think of subscribing to Image Journal, and you'll get poetry sent to you regularly and be invited to inhabit the world in a new way. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you this morning, and wish you every blessing as you go into your week this week. Godspeed.